Hello and welcome back into the Yepso's universe. Today we're going to talk about the European institutions. Many people want to work in the institutions of the European Union to pass an Yepso competition, but let's be serious and honest at the same time. Do people actually know what the institutions are and how they are structured? If after seeing the title of this session and hear my first words you thought that the content was going to be far too basic for you, I encourage you to stay and watch this session. I intend to test everyone, those of you who are starting out in this field and those who believe you already mastered it. My name is Carlos Gil. I am the training director at Yepso and a researcher in European affairs affiliated with the University of Alcalá, one of the oldest universities in Europe. My research focuses on the European Union in general, and more specifically on the European Union civil service and its selection procedures. As you can see, while recording today's session, I'm not in the office. I happen to be almost 6,000 kilometers away from Europe, as I'm currently in the United States. As I mentioned in my first video, I travel a lot, so I won't be able to record from the same place every time and with the same dress code. In any case, what really matters is not the continent, but the content. In today's session, I'm going to introduce the general framework that led to the creation of the current institutions, discuss the theories that explain integration and its dynamics, and again, explore the role and functions of each institution. Remember to leave a like, subscribe if you are not yet part of this community of EU knowledge enthusiasts that we are building, and of course activate the bell so that YouTube notifies you every time we release a new video. Right then, let's take a proper look at the institutions that give shape to the European Union. As you probably know, the European Union is a very complex entity. In the first session, I told you that the distinguished Jacques Delors, who was president of the European Commission for 3 terms between 1985 and 1995, described it as a NUPO, an identified political object. Talking about what the European Union is or is not, compared with other organizations, would take at least a session like this, and that is not our focus today. But I do want to tell you that the European Union is the sum of several important components. Its legal structure, which is based on treaty law, on primary law, the legislation it creates, and customary practice. Its political sphere, its decision-making capacity, and of course, its administrative skeleton, made up of the institutions. We could probably point to other important components as well, such as, let's say, sociological and cultural elements, etc. Even so, let's stick to the essentials. The European Union cannot function on legal sources alone, nor on political will alone, just as we cannot live our lives solely on the basis of brain activity or emotional impulses. We need a body that allows us to execute our actions. In a similar way, the institutions of the European Union are the instruments that enables a daily dynamic of actions. They are the skeleton of the European institutions. This huge administrative skeleton is structured mainly around 2 concrete spheres: the institutions themselves and other administrative bodies. Which are the institutions of the European Union? That's a fair question, isn't it? This is actually very straightforward to define clearly. And I say this because the Treaty on the European Union, in its Article 13, paragraph 1, states plainly that the European Union's institution shall be the European Parliament, the European Council, the European Commission, the Court of Justice of the European Union, the European Central Bank, and finally, the European Court of Auditors. These are the 7 institutions, no more, no fewer. If you will allow me, knowing which the institutions are and what each other does is as basic, as elemental for anyone who wants to work in the EU institutions as knowing the countries that make up the European Union, and which we covered in the previous session. Therefore, if you're at an early stage discovering what the institutions are, the content of this session is extremely relevant. If you already know them, don't switch off and stay with us, because I'm sure that over the next few minutes, I will present some aspects that probably you will find useful. Why do we specifically have these 7 institutions in the European Union? Do you know the answer? I'm sure that if you take a moment to think through calmly, you will arrive at some solid reasoning. Well, let me tell you that I have asked myself the very same question, and I have two main arguments that obviously I want to share with you. On the one hand, because the European Union, as a sui generis institution that is in a process of mutation or evolution, call it what you will, towards a federal state model, has, through the successive treaties, been confused as a kind of, let's say, proto-state. For that reason, like practically any democratic state, it has been organized around a series of powers. We could say that the European Union is organized around 3 classical powers and 2 administrative ones. Regarding the classical powers, we can say that the European Commission and the European Council, together, in a certain sense, make up what we would say it is the executive power in a constitutional state. They define the course to take and the ways to achieve the priorities they set. Each operates differently, yes, but in a way we can consider that they together form the executive power of the European Union. On the other hand, we have the legislative power embodied by the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union. If you already know in depth how the ordinary legislative procedure works, something that obviously we will cover in future sessions, you will know that the Commission collaborates in this process through its right of legislative initiative. Important as that role is, we cannot deny that the 2 main actors in this field are the 2 already mentioned, the Council and the Parliament. Lastly, with the classical powers, we also find the judicial power, which in the EU clearly rests with the Court of Justice of the European Union. These are the 3 classical powers, and as you have seen, within them we have placed 5 of the EU institutions. What about the 2 institutions that remain? Are they not as relevant as the other? Well, yes, they are equally important, but we cannot slump them quite so neatly into those 3 powers. That's why I refer to 2 administrative powers. The European Central Bank represents another major institution present in any state. It's central bank, the body that manages monetary policy. It is autonomous and very important within the EU machinery. For this part, the European Court of Auditors plays another classical role in a constitutional democracy. It is the guarantor of the EU's financial oversight. So, as you can see, the EU's institutional architecture, in a way, mirrors that of a functional constitutional state. Is it slightly different? Yes, and I will explain why in a moment. But it closely emulates the legal political structure of a member state. This is the first argument I wanted to share with you. What do you think? Do you see it differently? I have brought you this argument because as a student of the institutions, I think it represents the legal institutional dynamics well, but you will certainly find other academics who defend different arguments. What about you? How do you see it? Do you agree with this argument? Let me know, please, in the comments below. I would love to read you. Right, earlier I told you I had 2 arguments to show. I have given you one, but I have another one, a complementary one, which in my humble opinion also explains the EU's institutional framework. It doesn't contradict the first, rather it reinforces it from a different angle. You have probably already noticed this. The EU lives in a constant tension between 2 poles of power, its own institutional dynamic and the power exercised by the member states. Before getting into that, I would like to pose a couple of more, let's say, theoretical questions and technical questions to gauge how familiar you are with the EU institutions. How about we go for the first one? Are you ready? I will give you 1 minute to solve it. Let's go! How did it go? Did you get the correct option? It is not easy, I know. Obviously, if you are not familiar with the theories of European integration, does the fact that I have brought you this kind of question mean you should expect it in the exam? No. In fact, I don't think it is a typical exam question. So then why did I bring it here? Because anyone who studies the EU institutions, in my view, should know the theoretical foundations, and the integration theories are one of those foundations. They help explain why the EU is the way it is. Just as our students at Yepso dedicate a whole unit to explore this in our intense programs, I didn't want to miss the chance to look at it here with you. Right then, let's go through it. The correct solution is option D. All of the above are correct. Option A is correct because the notion of spillover is indeed rooted in neo-functionalist theories, especially in the work of Ernest Haas, more specifically in his 1958 work, The Unity of Europe, which obviously I recommended to you. Option B is also correct, as this fully captures the functional dimension of spillover. Once integration begins in one sector, pressures arise for integration in adjacent fields. For example, economic integration leads to monetary or social policy integration. And in line with the above, option C is also correct. Institutions such as European Commission or the Court of Auditors can push integration forward, interpreting their roles broadly and creating dynamics that encourage further transfers of competences. Therefore, all of that takes us back to what I said. Option D is the correct answer. How about we move on to the second question? Are you ready? Again, I will give you 1 minute to solve it. The clock starts now. Again, this was not an easy one, right? In this case, there is only one correct option, and that is option B, which best captures the essence of intergovernmentalist theory, as developed by scholars such as Stanley Hoffman and later Andrew Moravcsik, a liberal intergovernmentalist I already referred to in the previous session. According to this view, European integration progresses not through automatic dynamics, but through negotiation and compromise among governments, which deliberately decide how much sovereignty to pool while remaining the principal actors in control of the process. I hope bringing these concepts in hasn't made the session too arid for you. I don't want us to go too far into an overly academic field or into the tension between the two main integration theories I have presented: neo-functionalism and intergovernmentalism. All you need to retain is that the neo-functionalist thesis hold that the EU is in continuous evolution due to its own internal dynamic. They defend the spillover effect or the overflow of competences and legal sources, which, represented very graphically, would be like a drop that keeps falling until it overflows the glass. The claim is that the EU has a life of its own, producing continuous advances in integration. By contrast, intergovernmentalist theses argue that the EU advances and integrates because of the interest of the member states, who are always behind those advances. I know this isn't the most complete or technical explanation, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity to share with you a couple of brush strokes of this thesis so that if you want to go deeper, you can do so from now on. Likewise, if you would like us to tackle this in greater depth in future sessions, tell me in the comments. Your comments guide our future videos. As I was saying, a key dimension is that the EU lives in constant tension between the power of its institutional dynamic and the power of the member states. That is why it has organized itself with institutions that represent spheres of power we can, in a sense, call autonomous, such as the Commission, the Parliament, the Court of Justice of the European Union, the European Court of Auditors, and even we can say that the European Central Bank. However, as a counterweight to the main institutions, it has set up intergovernmental checks. This means that there are institutions where the national perspective of the states is important. For that reason, the Commission is, to an extent, balanced by the European Council and the European Parliament by the Council. I'm giving you the general picture, but don't worry, we will now look at it in more detail. I wanted to follow a top-down perspective. First, show you a general view of the organization of the institutions, and then look at each one separately. We will follow the same logic I used when identifying the institutions based on the powers. The executive power of the European Union is identified with the European Council and the European Commission. The European Commission is the Union's governing body. Like virtually any state, it comprises a president and 26 commissioners, each of whom has a specific policy portfolio. The Commission is formed taking into account the results of the European Parliament elections, the preferences of the Member States expressed through the European Council, and subject to the approval of the European Parliament. As with each institution, we will look at the Commission in more depth in a future video. For now, just remember that it is a kind of very special government of the European Union. On the other hand, we have the European Council. Do you know what it is? In fact, before I tell you, I'm going to pose you a question. Are you ready for it? You have 1 minute to solve it. Let's go. Well, we are back here in a different scenario. How did it go? Did you manage to find the correct answer? I hope so. Let's explore this question. What was your answer? I hope you chose option D. The European Council is made up of the heads of a state or government of the member states. As I hinted a few minutes ago, it is a highly important intergovernmental body. Through its meetings, the head of a state and government discusses the EU's most sensitive issues and takes fundamental decisions for the Union's future. A clear example of how its activity shapes the course of the European institutions is that every 5 years it publishes the EU's strategic priorities. This document sets the pace of the EU's political and institutional priorities. I recommend you to download it and read it in depth because, as you can imagine, it covers key topics for the EU knowledge test. We also have two legislative bodies, the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union. If you are not very familiar with the institutions, the name Council of the European Union may have surprised you. Is it different from the European Council? Yes, They share some elements such as almost the name, the fact that both operate with a strong intergovernmental logic, and that they even share the same building in Brussels. And we could say even that they share the same task force, the Secretariat General. But let's unpack the Spider-Man meme here and make clear what distinguishes the Council from the European Council. First, you can see in the meme the Council of Europe. We can leave this body out from the outset as it does not belong to the EU ecosystem, as you probably know. It is an international organization dedicated to human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. However, as I say, it is independent. It is not part of the EU's structure. Next, we have the European Council, which, as we have seen, is the EU's institution where the EU's head of state and government meet. It embodies the executive power of the European Union, or at least one of its sphere. And a different EU institution is the Council of the European Union, or simply the Council. It is the institution where ministers from the relevant areas of the different member states meet to discuss key legislative topics within their competence. As you can see, it is slightly different. Well, now let's look at it from a more, let's say, practical angle. For example, the European Commission may propose to legislate on a given subject. Let's say, for example, a health initiative. And the health ministers from the different member states, they meet, of course, and their team in the Council to discuss the implications and to propose amendments. This would happen under the ordinary legislative procedure, but it's also worth mentioning that the Council has the possibility to ask an initiative from the European Commission and to manage it through a special legislative procedure. However, the Council is not the only institution that embodies the legislative power, as we have also seen. We also have the European Parliament. As you surely know, it is composed of 725 members of the European Parliament, elected by universal suffrage every 5 years in the European elections. The European Parliament directly represents the citizens of the Union. Its function focuses mainly on the discussion and adoption of legislative procedures. As you can see, the European Parliament is a key institution and a very neo-functionalist one, as you can see. If we turn to the third classical power, the judicial power, we necessarily have to look at the Court of Justice of the European Union. It is the guarantor of the EU's legal framework, which, by the way, takes precedence over national legal orders on the basis of the principle of primacy of EU law. We will look at it in greater detail, but for now, keep in mind that the court is structured into two major courts. On the one hand, we have the Court of Justice. Yes, it has a name very similar to the institution as a whole, which is the EU's highest judicial authority. Its main function is to ensure the uniform interpretation of EU law. It is composed of 27 judges, one per each member state, and up to 11 advocates general. On the other hand, the General Court, which hears actions brought by individuals, companies, and in some cases, member states on very specific subject matters. It is a lower court within the same institution. The General Court has 2 judges from each member state, but no advocates general. Keep these key facts in mind, as they are exactly the kind of content you may well encounter in the EU knowledge exam. Well, let's continue now. Within the classical structure of powers, I mentioned 2 administrative powers that are embodied by 2 different institutions. Do you remember which ones? Well, first we have the European Central Bank, the ECB. It is based in Frankfurt, in Germany. It is the core institution responsible for managing the euro and ensuring price stability across the euro area. It sets monetary policy, supervises major banks through the single supervisory mechanism, and works to maintain financial stability, making it a key pillar on the European Economic and Monetary Union. The ECB is a paradigmatic example of neo-functionalist integration because its independence and supranational decision-making power drive European integration beyond mere intergovernmental cooperation. And finally, we complete the picture of the 7 institutions with the European Court of Auditors, which audits the Union's revenue and expenditure. It is based in Luxembourg, from where it audits the EU's finances to ensure legality, regularity, and obviously sound financial management. It works to ensure democratic accountability of the institutions and also to guarantee sound financial management, I have just said. So this is the EU's main skeleton. And a skeleton, as you know, it is essential in any body. It provides a structure and also protects our organs. Without it, obviously, we could not function. And in fact, the same is true to the EU institutions. However, let me ask you another question here. Can we live without organs and other key elements such as muscles, for example? We can't, can we? It is the same with the European Union. Beyond these institutions, the EU is made up of other bodies that are key to the day-to-day functioning of the EU institutions. In the next session, we are going to talk about those bodies so that you have a complete picture and a clearer understanding of what they are. I think that with what we have covered today, we have already taken an important step. It's been an intense session, but I hope a very productive one. I trust that you have found everything I have shared useful and that things are clear now. I said that in the next session we would talk about other EU bodies, but I'm still defining the content of the ones that will follow. So please share in the comments which topic you would like me to cover in the upcoming sessions. Is there anything that you find particularly difficult and haven't yet managed to understand? Well, let me know, share it, and I will consider it for future sessions. And if you don't have any suggestions right now, I would still encourage you to leave a comment telling me what you thought of this session. It is really helpful not only to know that there is someone on the other side of the screen, but also to help me adapt the content for future videos. If you like this one, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet, and activate the bell. See you in the next session of Yepso's Universe. Have a great week.